"JUNGKOOK, let me ask you something." Jimmy Fallon leaned forward and looked directly at him. "Why does JIMIN always look at you like he's afraid of losing you?" The studio suddenly went silent. JUNGKOOK didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just stared at JIMIN. Then Jimmy asked another question. "And if tonight you told everyone a secret that would change your relationship forever, would JIMIN still be sitting next to you?" JIMIN's smile instantly disappeared. JUNGKOOK slowly picked up the microphone and took a deep breath. Every camera in the studio was now pointed at him. The audience could feel something strange in the air. JIMIN turned to him, confused. "JUNGKOOK, what are you doing?" JUNGKOOK looked at him with trembling eyes and said quietly, "Tonight, I want to reveal my wedding plan." For a second, nobody moved. Jimmy Fallon's eyes widened. The audience gasped, but the person who looked completely shocked was JIMIN. His face turned pale as if the entire world had suddenly stopped. And what happened next on live television was something nobody in that studio would ever forget. The studio suddenly felt smaller. Nobody laughed anymore. Even the audience that had been clapping and smiling only seconds ago now stared at JUNGKOOK in complete silence. Jimmy Fallon looked from JUNGKOOK to JIMIN and then back again. He wasn't sure if this was a joke or something much more serious. JIMIN slowly blinked. His fingers tightened around the microphone in his hand. "Wedding plan," he repeated softly. JUNGKOOK nodded once. "Yes." Jimmy immediately leaned closer. "Wait, are we really talking about marriage right now?" JUNGKOOK took another deep breath. "Yes, I've been thinking about it for a long time." Another wave of gasps spread through the studio. JIMIN was no longer smiling. His face became pale and he stared at JUNGKOOK as if he had never seen him before. "Why didn't you tell me?" JIMIN asked quietly. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. That silence somehow hurt even more. Jimmy could feel the tension building between them. "Guys, I suddenly feel like I'm sitting in the middle of something very personal." A few people laughed nervously, but the laughter disappeared almost instantly. JUNGKOOK finally looked at JIMIN. "Because I wasn't ready." JIMIN swallowed hard. "Not ready to tell me?" JUNGKOOK's eyes moved away. "Not ready to tell anyone." The answer sounded simple, but it felt heavy. JIMIN lowered his head for a second. RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, and Taehyung were sitting backstage watching the live broadcast on a monitor. None of them spoke. Jin looked worried. "This isn't good." RM crossed his arms. "He really did it." Taehyung looked completely confused. "Wait, does JIMIN know anything about this?" Nobody answered him. Back on stage, Jimmy slowly placed his cards on the desk. "Okay, I feel like there is a bigger story here. JUNGKOOK, when did you start planning this?" JUNGKOOK looked toward the audience and then back at Jimmy. "Months ago." JIMIN immediately turned toward him. "Months?" His voice cracked. JUNGKOOK nodded again. "Yes." JIMIN looked completely lost. Months. It meant JUNGKOOK had been carrying this secret for a very long time. And somehow, he never told him. The person sitting right beside him. The person who spent almost every day with him. The person who always thought there were no secrets between them. Jimmy noticed the change in JIMIN's expression. "You really didn't know?" JIMIN slowly shook his head. "No." The audience became even quieter. There was something painful about seeing someone realize they had been left outside of an important part of another person's life. JUNGKOOK looked at JIMIN again. For the first time that night, his calm expression showed a crack. He looked nervous, maybe even scared. "I wanted to tell you," he said softly. JIMIN laughed once, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Really? Because this doesn't feel like you wanted to tell me. JUNGKOOK had no answer. Jimmy looked between them again. He had interviewed celebrities for years, but he had never seen a moment like this. Something real was unfolding right in front of him. Something raw and emotional. "I think everyone here can feel this is important," Jimmy said carefully. "So let me ask another question. Why is this secret making JIMIN look so hurt?" Nobody spoke. JIMIN slowly looked down at his hands. JUNGKOOK stared at him. Seconds passed. The silence became unbearable. Then JUNGKOOK finally said something. "Because JIMIN is always the first person I tell everything to." Jimmy blinked. The audience gasped again. JIMIN looked up immediately. "Then why wasn't I this time?" JUNGKOOK's eyes looked suddenly heavy. "Because this decision involved you more than anyone else." The entire studio froze. Jimmy's mouth slowly opened. JIMIN looked completely shocked. "Me?" he whispered. JUNGKOOK nodded. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. The tension became so thick it almost felt visible. JIMIN stared at JUNGKOOK's face, searching for an explanation. But JUNGKOOK simply looked back at him with an expression JIMIN couldn't understand. And for the first time that night, JIMIN felt something he never expected to feel while sitting beside JUNGKOOK on live television. Fear. Because somehow he knew that whatever JUNGKOOK was about to reveal next would change everything between them. Before JUNGKOOK could say another word, Jimmy Fallon slowly leaned back in his chair. Even he looked nervous now. "Okay, I don't know where this is going, but I suddenly feel like I'm witnessing a major life event." A few people in the audience laughed softly, but the tension never disappeared. JIMIN couldn't take his eyes off JUNGKOOK. "What do you mean, this decision involves me?" he asked quietly. JUNGKOOK looked at him for several long seconds. Then he looked down. "Because no matter what happens in my future, I can't imagine making a big decision without thinking about you first." The audience collectively exhaled. JIMIN's expression changed again. This time he looked even more confused. His heart was beating too fast. He didn't know why his hands were shaking. "JUNGKOOK," he whispered. JUNGKOOK looked up again. His eyes looked red. "I know this sounds strange." Jimmy immediately interrupted. No, right now everything sounds mysterious." Some people laughed again, but Jimmy himself looked completely serious. He turned toward JIMIN. "You okay?" JIMIN forced a smile. "I don't know." The honesty of his answer made the audience laugh softly again, but everyone could see he wasn't joking. He really didn't know, because everything had changed in less than 2 minutes. He came to this show expecting a normal interview. He thought they would talk about music, funny memories, and future projects. Instead, JUNGKOOK had suddenly revealed a secret wedding plan and somehow connected it directly to him. Nothing made sense anymore. Backstage, the other BTS members looked just as stunned. Jin rubbed his face. "This is becoming dangerous." Taehyung frowned. "I still don't understand anything." Suga sighed quietly. Neither does Jimin. RM kept watching the screen without blinking. His expression looked serious, almost worried. J-Hope looked at him. "You know something, don't you?" RM didn't answer immediately. Then he sighed. "I know JUNGKOOK has been carrying something for a long time." "What thing?" Taehyung asked. RM slowly looked at him. "I don't think it's my secret to tell." Back on stage, Jimmy crossed his hands on the desk. "JUNGKOOK, let me ask you directly. Are you planning to get married soon?" The entire studio became silent again. JUNGKOOK took a deep breath. "I thought about it." Jimmy's eyes widened. "Thought about it?" JUNGKOOK nodded. "Many times." Boy, Jimin slowly turned toward him again. Every answer somehow created 10 more questions. "Who?" Jimin stopped talking. He suddenly couldn't finish the sentence. Jungkook noticed immediately. What? Jimin looked away for a second. Then he forced himself to continue. Who are you planning to marry? The question finally came out. The audience immediately reacted. Jimmy looked from one person to the other. Even he looked curious now. Jungkook didn't answer. 1 second passed, then another, then another. Jimin looked directly into his eyes. Jungkook? Still nothing. Jungkook simply stared back at him. Suddenly, Jimin felt uncomfortable. The way Jungkook was looking at him was different tonight. It was intense, almost painful. Why aren't you answering? Jimin asked softly. Jungkook opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked nervous for the first time in the entire interview. Jimmy blinked. Okay, now I'm nervous too. A few audience members laughed again, but then Jungkook finally spoke. Because I don't know if I'm allowed to say it. Complete silence. Jimmy looked confused. Jimin looked even more confused. Allowed, Jimin repeated. Jungkook nodded slowly. Yes. Who would stop you? Jimmy asked. Jungkook didn't answer. Instead, his eyes moved toward Jimin again. And this time, Jimin's breathing suddenly became unsteady. Because somehow, he had the terrible feeling that the answer he was looking for was much closer than he ever imagined. He didn't understand why that thought appeared in his mind. It made no sense, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Then Jungkook quietly said something that made the entire studio stop breathing. Because if I say everything tonight, one person's life might change forever. And as he said those words, he never looked away from Jimin. Nobody in the studio moved. It felt as if time itself had suddenly stopped. Jimin stared at Jungkook without blinking. His mind was racing. One person's life might change forever. And while saying those words, Jungkook had looked directly at him. Jimmy Fallon slowly lowered the cards in his hand. Even he seemed afraid to interrupt the moment. The audience remained completely silent. Some people were already exchanging nervous looks. They could feel the emotion in the room, even though they still didn't understand the secret behind it. Jimin finally swallowed hard. Why are you looking at me? He asked softly. Jungkook's expression changed. He looked like someone carrying a burden that had become too heavy to hide. Because... He stopped. His voice failed him. Jimin frowned. Because what? Another long silence. Then Jungkook looked away. Nothing. The answer immediately disappointed everyone in the studio. Jimmy blinked twice. No, you can't do that to us. You cannot say something that dramatic and then say nothing. The audience laughed nervously again, but Jimin didn't laugh. He couldn't. His heart was beating too fast. He was beginning to feel uneasy, because this wasn't like Jungkook at all. Jungkook was usually direct, calm, confident, but tonight he looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump or turn back. Jungkook, Jimin's voice became softer. You're scaring me. Those words immediately changed Jungkook's expression. He looked back at Jimin and suddenly seemed hurt. I'm not trying to scare you. Then tell me what's happening. Jungkook opened his mouth again, then closed it. He looked frustrated. Jimmy slowly raised his hand. I feel like I'm accidentally in the middle of a family meeting. The audience laughed once more, but even Jimmy's smile quickly disappeared. He looked genuinely concerned now. Backstage, the other members were just as tense. Jin looked at the monitor without moving. Suga crossed his arms. Taehyung looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. J-Hope shook his head slowly. I've never seen Jungkook like this. RM remained silent. Then he quietly said, He's struggling. Jin looked at him. With what? RM didn't answer right away. He watched Jungkook's face on the monitor. Then he sighed. With something he's been keeping inside for too long. Back on stage, Jimin suddenly remembered something. A memory from months ago. JUNGKOOK sitting alone in the practice room late at night. Looking tired, looking distracted. Jimin had asked if he was okay. JUNGKOOK had smiled and said he was fine. Then another memory appeared. JUNGKOOK canceling dinner plans. JUNGKOOK staring out of windows. JUNGKOOK becoming quiet whenever conversations turned toward the future. Jimin's expression slowly changed. He looked at JUNGKOOK again. "This has been bothering you for a long time, hasn't it?" JUNGKOOK looked surprised. Then he slowly nodded. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" JUNGKOOK's eyes suddenly looked emotional again. "Because I didn't want to make things difficult." Jimin looked confused. "Difficult for who?" JUNGKOOK looked directly into his eyes. "For you." Silence. Jimmy's eyes widened again. "Okay, I officially have 1,000 questions." Nobody laughed this time because everyone was staring at Jimin. His face had become pale again. He couldn't understand why every answer somehow returned to him. Why was everything connected to him? Why was JUNGKOOK protecting him? Why did this wedding plan involve him so deeply? Jimin's breathing became slightly uneven. "I don't understand." JUNGKOOK looked at him quietly. Then, for the first time that night, he smiled. But it was a sad smile. "I know." Something about that smile made Jimin's chest tighten. Suddenly, Jimmy spoke again. "JUNGKOOK, if you could say one thing right now to make Jimin understand, what would it be?" Everyone looked at JUNGKOOK. Even the audience leaned forward. JUNGKOOK thought for several seconds. Then he answered in a calm voice. "I never wanted to leave someone behind." The entire studio fell silent again. Jimin's eyes widened slightly, because those words sounded strangely personal, almost like a confession. JUNGKOOK looked down at his hands. "That's why I made the plan." Jimin's eyebrows slowly pulled together. "You made a wedding plan because you didn't want to leave someone behind?" JUNGKOOK nodded once. Jimmy looked completely confused now. "I feel like I need a giant chart to understand this conversation." A few people laughed, but then the laughter disappeared, because Jimin's face had suddenly changed. He remembered something else, a conversation from years ago. They had been sitting together after a concert, exhausted, happy, talking about life. Jimin had once said something casually. He had laughed while saying it. He had said, "I hate being left behind." At that time, JUNGKOOK had gone strangely quiet. He never forgot important things people said, especially things Jimin said. Suddenly, Jimin's breathing stopped for a second. He looked at JUNGKOOK differently now. No, it couldn't be. It made no sense. But before he could say anything, JUNGKOOK slowly lifted his head and looked at him again. Then he said the words that made everyone in the studio freeze once more. "I made that plan because of something you said to me years ago." And this time, Jimin could no longer hide the shock on his face. The words hung in the air like a storm that had suddenly stopped moving. Jimin simply stared at JUNGKOOK. Years ago. Something he said years ago. He could remember dozens of conversations they had shared over the years, late-night talks in hotel rooms, random conversations inside practice studios, long flights where they talked about dreams, fears, and the future. But he never imagined that one simple sentence from years ago could somehow lead to this moment. "What did I say?" Jimin asked quietly. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Jimin's face. "You really don't remember?" Jimin slowly shook his head. JUNGKOOK looked down and smiled sadly again. "I guess that's normal." Jimin became even more confused. "JUNGKOOK, please, stop talking like this." The emotion in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. Jimmy Fallon looked between them, afraid to interrupt. The audience remained completely silent. It no longer felt like a television interview. It felt like two people accidentally opening a door they had kept closed for years. JUNGKOOK finally looked back at him. "You once said something after a concert." JIMIN frowned, trying to remember. JUNGKOOK continued, "You said that one day everyone would have their own lives. Everyone would eventually go somewhere else." JIMIN blinked. A vague memory slowly returned. JUNGKOOK's voice became softer. "Then you laughed and said you hated the idea of being left behind." Suddenly, the memory became clear. They had been exhausted after a concert overseas. They were sitting on the floor backstage. Everyone else had already gone to shower or eat. It was only the two of them. JIMIN remembered laughing and saying those words because everyone had been talking about the future. Marriage, families, different dreams. He remembered saying he hated the thought of everyone eventually leaving and moving on. At that time, he thought it was just a random conversation. He never thought about it again. But JUNGKOOK apparently did. JIMIN stared at him in disbelief. "You remembered that?" JUNGKOOK looked surprised by the question. "Of course I remembered." The answer came so naturally that it made the entire room even quieter. JIMIN didn't know what to say. JUNGKOOK's eyes slowly lowered again. "I remember most things you tell me." Nobody moved. Jimmy looked speechless. Even some audience members covered their mouths. JIMIN himself looked completely unprepared for that answer. "Why?" he asked softly. JUNGKOOK looked at him again. This time there was no hesitation. "Because you're important to me." Silence. Complete silence. Jimmy blinked several times. He looked toward the audience as if asking if everyone had heard the same thing. JIMIN simply stared at JUNGKOOK. Something inside him felt strangely heavy. He suddenly couldn't breathe normally. Because JUNGKOOK wasn't joking. Every word he said tonight sounded painfully sincere. "So," JIMIN's voice almost disappeared. "You made your wedding plan because of one thing I said years ago?" JUNGKOOK nodded slowly. "Yes." "I don't understand." JUNGKOOK looked down at his hands again. Then he spoke so quietly that everyone in the studio had to listen carefully. "Because I started wondering what would happen if everyone really moved on someday." JIMIN's face remained confused. JUNGKOOK continued, "What if everyone had their own lives, their own families, their own futures?" He looked up again. "And what if you really ended up alone?" JIMIN's expression completely froze. The audience gasped softly. Jimmy's mouth slowly opened. JUNGKOOK's eyes were now slightly red. "I couldn't stop thinking about it." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere suddenly became much heavier than before. JIMIN looked like he had forgotten where he was. He was trying to understand what JUNGKOOK had just admitted. JUNGKOOK had been carrying this thought for years. He had worried about him, thought about his future, wondered if he would be lonely. And somehow, all of that had eventually become connected to a secret wedding plan. JIMIN swallowed hard. "You were worried about me?" JUNGKOOK immediately answered. "Yes." There wasn't even a second of hesitation. JIMIN looked away for a moment because he suddenly didn't know how to react. Jimmy carefully leaned forward. "Okay, I think everyone here is emotional right now, including me. But I still don't understand the wedding part." The audience laughed softly again, mostly because Jimmy had asked the exact question in everyone's mind. JUNGKOOK looked toward Jimmy, then back at JIMIN. He took another deep breath. It looked like he had finally reached the point where he couldn't hide anymore. "Because when I started thinking about the future," he said quietly, "I realized there was one thing I wanted more than anything." JIMIN slowly looked back at him. "What?" JUNGKOOK looked directly into his eyes. I wanted to make sure you would never feel left behind." The words hit Jimin like a wave. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. Because for the first time that night, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't about marriage anymore. This wasn't even about a secret plan. This was about years of feelings, worries, promises, and emotions that JUNGKOOK had been carrying alone. And judging from the way JUNGKOOK was looking at him right now, he wasn't finished telling the truth. Nobody in the studio said anything. It felt as though every person in the room had forgotten they were watching a live television show. Jimin remained completely still. His eyes never left JUNGKOOK's face. He kept replaying the words inside his head. "I wanted to make sure you would never feel left behind." The sentence sounded simple, but the emotion behind it was anything but simple. Jimmy Fallon slowly looked at the audience and then back at the two of them. Even he looked affected by what he had just heard. "Okay," he said softly. "I need to ask this carefully." He looked at JUNGKOOK. "You've been thinking about Jimin's future for years?" JUNGKOOK answered immediately. "Yes." Jimmy blinked. "Years?" "Yes." Another silence followed. Jimin lowered his eyes for a second. He suddenly remembered so many little moments. JUNGKOOK asking if he had eaten. JUNGKOOK waiting for him after schedules ended. JUNGKOOK noticing when he was tired even before he said anything. JUNGKOOK always looking for him first in crowded places. None of those moments had seemed unusual before. They had been together for so many years that caring for each other felt natural. But tonight, under these lights, everything suddenly looked different. "Why?" Jimin asked quietly. JUNGKOOK looked at him. "Because I care about you." Jimin's breathing became uneven again. Everyone cares about each other. JUNGKOOK slowly shook his head. "This is different." The answer immediately made Jimmy sit up straighter. The audience gasped softly again. Jimin looked like someone had taken all the air out of the room. "Different?" he repeated. JUNGKOOK nodded once, then another long silence appeared. He seemed to be choosing his next words very carefully. "I've always worried about everyone," he said. "But with you..." He stopped again. Jimmy was practically leaning over his desk now. "With him?" JUNGKOOK looked directly at Jimin. "I worry more." Nobody moved. Jimin's eyes widened slightly. Backstage, RM slowly closed his eyes. Jin looked at him immediately. "You knew!" RM opened his eyes again. "Not everything. But you knew something." RM looked back at the monitor. "I knew JUNGKOOK carried a different kind of concern whenever it came to Jimin." Taehyung looked confused. "Different how?" RM sighed quietly. "The kind of concern that doesn't disappear even after years." Nobody said anything after that. On stage, Jimmy carefully cleared his throat. "Okay, I think this is the most serious interview I've ever hosted." He looked at JUNGKOOK. "Let's go back to the wedding plan." JUNGKOOK nodded slowly. Jimmy continued. "What exactly was your plan?" The question immediately changed the atmosphere again. "Tul?" Jimin looked at JUNGKOOK. The audience leaned forward. JUNGKOOK took a deep breath, then another. It almost looked like he was preparing himself for something dangerous. "I made rules," he said quietly. Jimmy frowned. "Rules?" "Yes." "For your marriage?" "Yes." Jimmy looked even more confused. "What kind of rules?" JUNGKOOK lowered his eyes for a second before answering. "I promised myself that if I ever got married..." He stopped. Then he slowly looked at Jimin again. "I would never disappear from the people I love." Silence. Jimin's eyebrows slowly pulled together. JUNGKOOK continued. "I wouldn't suddenly become too busy. I wouldn't stop calling. I wouldn't forget important people." His voice became softer. "And I would make sure nobody I care about feels abandoned." Nobody moved. Jimin looked at him as if he were hearing him speak for the first time, because there was something heartbreaking in JUNGKOOK's voice, something lonely. Jimmy carefully asked another question. Did you make these rules because you were afraid of becoming distant from people? JUNGKOOK nodded. Yes. And Jimmy hesitated. Was Jimin the person you were thinking about? Another long silence filled the studio. JUNGKOOK looked directly into Jimin's eyes. Jimin's heart immediately began pounding again. Then JUNGKOOK quietly answered. Mostly, yes, the audience gasped. Jimmy covered his mouth. Even he looked shocked now. Jimin simply stared at him. His expression slowly changed from confusion into something else, something emotional. Because for the first time tonight, he realized something he had never noticed before. All these years, while he had been afraid of losing people, someone else had been quietly afraid of losing him too. And somehow that fear had grown so large that it became a promise, a plan, a secret that JUNGKOOK had carried for years without telling anyone. Then JUNGKOOK said something that made the entire studio freeze once again. I never made the plan because I wanted a wedding. He paused. His eyes remained on JIMIN. I made it because I wanted a future where you're still in it.
Nobody in the studio reacted for several seconds. It was almost impossible to process what JUNGKOOK had just said. I made it because I wanted a future where you're still in it. The words remained in the air like something too important to disappear. Jimin simply stared at him. He forgot about the cameras. He forgot about the audience. He even forgot they were sitting on Jimmy Fallon's stage. Suddenly, it felt like only the two of them existed in that room. Jimmy slowly blinked. Then he blinked again. Okay, he said carefully. I officially don't know what to say. A few nervous laughs came from the audience, but the emotion in the room remained heavy. Jimin swallowed hard. A future. Where I'm still in it? He repeated quietly. JUNGKOOK nodded. Yes. Jimin looked completely lost. Why? The question came out almost like a whisper. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. He looked at Jimin with an expression nobody had seen from him before. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something he had hidden for years. Because I can't imagine my future without you being part of it. Silence. The audience gasped loudly this time. Jimmy's eyes widened again. Backstage, Jin covered his face with both hands. Taeyoung's mouth slowly opened. J-Hope looked completely frozen. Suga exhaled deeply. RM simply stared at the monitor without speaking. He looked worried, very worried. On stage, Jimin looked as if the world had suddenly shifted under his feet. He couldn't even answer. He simply stared at JUNGKOOK, because JUNGKOOK's voice sounded so sincere that it almost hurt to hear. JUNGKOOK, he said softly, but nothing else came out. He didn't know what to say, because every answer he had prepared disappeared from his mind. Jimmy slowly cleared his throat again. Can I ask something? Nobody looked at him. He looked almost embarrassed to interrupt. Is this the first time you've ever said these things out loud? JUNGKOOK finally looked toward him. Then he nodded. Yes? Jimmy looked surprised. Never to anyone? Never. Not even the members? No. Backstage, all 5 members looked at one another. Even they seemed shocked. Jin slowly turned toward RM. You really didn't know? RM shook his head. No, not this much. Taeyoung looked back at the screen. He's saying everything tonight. Suga sighed quietly. Maybe he's tired of carrying it alone. Back on stage, Jimmy looked toward Jimin. And this is your first time hearing all of this? Jimin slowly nodded. Yes. He looked overwhelmed. Jimmy gently leaned forward. How do you feel? The question caught him off guard. How did he feel? He didn't even know. There were too many emotions happening at once. Shock, confusion, sadness, something warm, something painful. He stopped. Then he laughed once. It was a nervous laugh. I really don't know. The audience smiled softly this time. They could see how overwhelmed he was. Jimin looked at JUNGKOOK again. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked quietly. JUNGKOOK's expression immediately changed. "Because I thought it would become a burden." JIMIN frowned. "A burden?" JUNGKOOK nodded. "I didn't want you to feel responsible for my feelings." The answer made JIMIN go silent again. JUNGKOOK continued, "You already carry a lot of things. I didn't want to add another one." Nobody moved. The room suddenly became emotional again. JIMIN looked down at his hands. For some reason, hearing that hurt. Because all this time, JUNGKOOK had been protecting him from feelings he never even knew existed. "You carried all of this by yourself?" he asked quietly. JUNGKOOK smiled softly. "I tried." JIMIN looked up again. "For years?" JUNGKOOK nodded once. Another silence followed. Jimmy looked between them again. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. "JUNGKOOK, were you lonely?" The entire room became still. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. He looked down. Then he looked toward the audience. Then back at JIMIN. Finally, he smiled again. It was another sad smile. "Sometimes." The answer was simple, but somehow it made the atmosphere even heavier. JIMIN's eyes slowly widened, because he suddenly remembered all the moments when JUNGKOOK looked tired or distracted, all the times he asked if he was okay and received the same answer, "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. Maybe he hadn't been fine for a long time. JIMIN suddenly felt guilty. "Why didn't I notice?" he whispered to himself. But JUNGKOOK heard him. "Because I didn't let you." JIMIN looked up. JUNGKOOK's expression softened. "I wanted you to smile." "Nobody said anything." JUNGKOOK continued. "You always take care of other people. I didn't want you worrying about me too." JIMIN's eyes slowly became red. He looked away for a second. Jimmy looked emotional himself now. "I did not expect to cry tonight," he admitted softly. "Some people laugh through their emotions." But then the laughter disappeared again because JIMIN suddenly looked back at JUNGKOOK. His voice became almost a whisper. "You really thought I might end up alone one day?" JUNGKOOK looked directly at him. There wasn't even a second of hesitation. "Yes?" JIMIN stared at him. JUNGKOOK's voice became quiet. "And the idea scared me more than I can explain." Silence filled the studio again. Then JUNGKOOK slowly added something that made everyone's heart stop for a second. "Because if you ever felt left behind, I know I would blame myself for it." And for the first time since the interview started, JIMIN looked like he might completely break down right there on Jimmy Fallon's stage. The studio became completely silent again. JIMIN couldn't move. He couldn't even blink properly. "I would blame myself for it." The words echoed inside his head over and over. He looked at JUNGKOOK as if he were seeing a different person sitting beside him. Because nobody had ever admitted something like that to him before. Nobody had ever said they were that afraid of him being lonely. Nobody had ever carried that kind of responsibility for him. Jimmy Fallon slowly leaned back in his chair. Even he looked emotional now. "Wow," he said quietly. "That's wow." The audience didn't laugh this time. They simply watched. Some people were already wiping their eyes. JIMIN slowly lowered his head. He suddenly couldn't look at JUNGKOOK anymore. His eyes were beginning to sting. "Why?" he whispered. JUNGKOOK immediately looked concerned. "JIMIN?" JIMIN's voice trembled slightly. "Why would you blame yourself?" JUNGKOOK looked surprised by the question, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you're important to me." JIMIN lifted his head again. His eyes were red now. JUNGKOOK's expression immediately changed. He looked worried. "Hey," he said softly. But JIMIN interrupted him. "No, tell me." His voice became shaky. "Why would my happiness become your responsibility?" JUNGKOOK stared at him for several seconds. Then he quietly answered, "Because I care whether you're happy or not." Silence. JIMIN looked away again. He suddenly couldn't breathe normally. Jimmy looked at the audience and then back at them. "I don't know if this is an interview anymore," he admitted. "This feels like something incredibly personal." Nobody disagreed. Because it was personal. Too personal. JIMIN slowly rubbed his eyes. He looked overwhelmed. JUNGKOOK looked increasingly nervous. He had probably expected surprise tonight. Maybe even confusion. But seeing JIMIN look emotional seemed to make him panic. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked quietly. JIMIN immediately looked at him. "Wrong?" He almost laughed again. I don't even know what to think anymore. JUNGKOOK looked worried. I didn't mean to upset you. JIMIN stared at him, and suddenly something inside him cracked. That's the problem. JUNGKOOK blinked. What? JIMIN's eyes looked brighter now. You keep doing that. Doing what? Protecting me. Nobody moved. JIMIN continued. You keep deciding everything by yourself because you think it'll make things easier for me. His voice trembled again. You kept all of this inside for years. JUNGKOOK looked down. JIMIN's expression became more emotional. You were lonely. Silence. You worried about me. Silence again. You made plans because you were scared for my future. JIMIN's voice became softer, and I didn't know any of it. Nobody in the studio made a sound. Because for the first time tonight, JIMIN looked genuinely hurt. Not because of the wedding plan, not because of the secret, but because someone he cared about had been carrying something heavy all by himself. JUNGKOOK looked at him quietly. Then he smiled softly again. You don't have to feel bad. JIMIN immediately looked at him. See? He said. You're doing it again. JUNGKOOK blinked. What? JIMIN looked like he was about to cry and laugh at the same time. You're comforting me right now. The audience reacted softly. JUNGKOOK looked confused. JIMIN shook his head slowly. You've been carrying this alone for years, and somehow you're still trying to make me feel better. For the first time that night, JUNGKOOK didn't know what to say. He simply looked at him. Jimmy slowly covered his mouth again. I cannot believe I'm witnessing this conversation. Backstage, the members remained frozen. Jin sighed deeply. This is hard to watch. Taeyoung nodded slowly. I didn't know they understood each other this much. Suga looked at the monitor. I don't think they understood each other this much. Everyone looked at him. Suga's expression remained calm. I think they're only realizing it now. Nobody said anything after that, because somehow it felt true. On stage, JIMIN slowly looked at JUNGKOOK again. Were you really that scared? He asked softly. JUNGKOOK looked at him. About what? Me being left behind. JUNGKOOK didn't hesitate. Yes. JIMIN swallowed hard. Even after all these years? Yes. Even now? JUNGKOOK's eyes softened. Especially now. Silence. Absolute silence. JIMIN looked completely stunned by that answer, because he realized something frightening. This wasn't a temporary feeling. This wasn't a random thought. JUNGKOOK had carried this concern for years. It had stayed with him, grown with him, followed him into adulthood. And it was still there. Still strong enough to bring him to this stage and make him reveal everything on live television. JIMIN looked at him carefully. Then he asked a question so quietly that only the microphones could catch it. Why tonight? JUNGKOOK froze. Jimmy immediately looked up. The audience leaned forward. The question had finally arrived. Why tonight? Why reveal everything now? JUNGKOOK looked at JIMIN for a long time, longer than before. His expression slowly changed. He looked nervous again, almost afraid. Then he took a deep breath and quietly said, because something happened 3 days ago. The entire studio went silent. JIMIN frowned. 3 days ago? JUNGKOOK nodded. His eyes never left JIMIN's face. You said something to me. JIMIN looked confused. I did? JUNGKOOK nodded again. Then he whispered the words that made JIMIN's entire expression freeze. You said, maybe everyone eventually leaves. The entire studio froze. JIMIN's eyes widened slowly. 3 days ago. He searched his memory immediately. He had spoken to JUNGKOOK 3 days ago. In fact, they had spent almost the entire evening together after practice. They had eaten dinner. They had talked about schedules. They had laughed. Then suddenly, one memory returned clearly. They had been sitting alone in the company lounge. It was late. Almost everyone had already gone home. JIMIN had looked out the window and casually said something. Maybe everyone eventually leaves. He remembered saying it, but he didn't remember why. At least, he didn't think it had been important. Yet now JUNGKOOK was looking at him like that sentence had changed everything. JIMIN swallowed hard. I remember saying it. JUNGKOOK nodded. Nobody moved. Jimmy looked between them carefully. What happened after he said that? He asked softly. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. He looked down for several seconds. Then he slowly raised his eyes again. I couldn't sleep that night. Silence. Jimin stared at him. JUNGKOOK continued quietly. I kept thinking about it. His voice became even softer. I kept hearing you say it over and over. Nobody in the audience made a sound. Maybe everyone eventually leaves. JUNGKOOK repeated the sentence slowly. You looked sad when you said it. Jimin frowned. Did I? JUNGKOOK nodded. Yes. Jimin looked confused. He honestly couldn't remember his expression anymore. To him, it had just been another random conversation. But clearly, it wasn't random to JUNGKOOK. Then what? Jimmy asked. JUNGKOOK looked toward him briefly before turning back to Jimin. I suddenly realized something. Silence. I realized I never wanted you to believe that. Jimin blinked. JUNGKOOK looked directly into his eyes. I never wanted you to think everyone leaves. Nobody moved. The room felt heavy again. Jimin simply stared at him. JUNGKOOK's expression remained serious. I wanted to tell you that someone would stay. Another silence filled the studio. Jimmy slowly lowered his head. Even he looked emotional now. Jimin's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. JUNGKOOK continued. But then I realized something else. Jimin finally found his voice. What? JUNGKOOK's eyes looked uncertain now, almost nervous. I realized I've spent years thinking about your future. Silence. I've spent years worrying about your happiness. Silence again. And 3 nights ago, he stopped. His breathing became uneven. Everyone could see it. This part was difficult for him. Jimin looked worried now. JUNGKOOK? JUNGKOOK looked at him again. 3 nights ago, I finally asked myself why. Nobody breathed. Not the audience. Not Jimmy. Nobody. Jimin's expression slowly changed. He could suddenly feel his heart pounding inside his chest again. Why? He asked softly. JUNGKOOK didn't answer. Instead, he looked away for a second. Then he laughed quietly. It was nervous. I didn't expect myself to find an answer. Jimmy looked completely focused now. Jimin didn't even blink. Then JUNGKOOK looked directly at him again. But I did. Silence. Absolute silence. Jimin's hands tightened around his microphone. He suddenly felt nervous too, even though he didn't know why. Because the way JUNGKOOK was looking at him right now felt different. More serious than before. More honest. And? Jimmy asked softly. JUNGKOOK didn't look at him. His eyes remained on Jimin, and I realized. He stopped again. Jimin's breathing became uneven. Nobody moved. Then JUNGKOOK finally whispered, I don't think I was afraid of you being alone. Jimin's eyes widened slightly. Jimmy looked confused. The audience leaned forward again. JUNGKOOK continued, I think. He swallowed hard. I was afraid of losing my place in your life. Complete silence. It felt as if every sound inside the studio had disappeared. Jimin didn't move at all. He looked completely frozen. Jimmy's mouth slowly opened. Backstage, all 5 BTS members stared at the monitor without blinking. Nobody said anything. Nobody even seemed capable of speaking. On stage, JUNGKOOK looked nervous for the first time since he began revealing his secret. He looked almost scared, but he didn't look away. I think that's what frightened me all these years, he said quietly. The idea that one day you wouldn't need me anymore? Nobody moved. Jimin looked like he had forgotten how to breathe, because suddenly, everything made sense. The worries, the plans, the promises, the secret rules, the fear of people leaving. None of it had been about marriage. None of it had been about the future itself. It had been about one question that JUNGKOOK had apparently carried inside his heart for years. What happens if one day Jimin's life moves forward, and there's no longer a place for me in it? And judging by the expression on JUNGKOOK's face right now, he still didn't know the answer. Nobody moved. The silence became almost unbearable. Jimin sat there completely frozen, still staring at JUNGKOOK. The idea that one day you wouldn't need me anymore. The sentence kept repeating inside his head. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know how to respond to it, because he had never imagined that JUNGKOOK was carrying a fear like that. For years, completely alone. Jimmy Fallon slowly put both hands on his desk. Even he looked overwhelmed. He stopped and sighed. I feel like everyone in this room forgot there are cameras here. Nobody laughed. Because it was true. This no longer felt like television. It felt like something deeply personal that should have happened in a quiet room with no audience. Jimin's lips parted slightly. He looked like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. JUNGKOOK noticed immediately. "You don't have to answer," he said softly. Jimin looked at him. There it was again. The same thing. JUNGKOOK protecting him, making things easier for him, carrying the uncomfortable feelings himself. Jimin suddenly lowered his eyes. Then he laughed quietly. It wasn't happiness. It sounded emotional. "You're really unbelievable." JUNGKOOK blinked. "What?" Jimin slowly shook his head. "Even now." He looked back at him. "You're worried about making me uncomfortable." JUNGKOOK didn't answer. Because it was true. Jimin looked at him for several long seconds. Then he asked quietly, "Why did you never tell me this?" JUNGKOOK looked down again. "Because I thought it was selfish." Silence. Jimin frowned. "Selfish?" JUNGKOOK nodded. "Yes." "How?" JUNGKOOK took a deep breath. "Because people change." He looked at Jimin again. "People grow. They meet new people. They build different lives." His voice became softer. "I didn't think I had the right to be afraid of losing my place in yours." Nobody moved. Jimin's expression changed again. Something painful appeared in his eyes. JUNGKOOK continued quietly. "I thought it was just something I needed to accept." Silence. So I kept it to myself. Another silence followed. Jimmy looked emotional again. Even the audience looked affected. Jimin slowly looked away. He suddenly remembered so many moments over the years. Times when he naturally leaned on JUNGKOOK. Times when he searched for him first in crowded rooms. Times when he laughed because JUNGKOOK was there. Times when he felt safe simply because JUNGKOOK was nearby. He had never thought about it carefully before, because JUNGKOOK had always been there. Always. Suddenly his chest tightened. "You really thought one day I'd just—" He couldn't finish the sentence. JUNGKOOK looked at him quietly. Jimin forced himself to continue. "You thought I'd leave you behind?" The room became completely silent again. JUNGKOOK didn't answer immediately. Then he slowly nodded. Once. That was enough. Jimin simply stared at him. He looked hurt. Genuinely hurt. "How could you think that?" he whispered. JUNGKOOK looked surprised by the question. "Because." He looked confused now. "Because that's what happens sometimes." Jimin slowly shook his head. "No." JUNGKOOK blinked. "No?" Jimin's voice became stronger. "No." Silence. He looked directly into JUNGKOOK's eyes now. "Do you really think you're someone I could just leave behind?" Nobody moved. Even Jimmy looked stunned by the question. JUNGKOOK looked frozen. Jimin continued before he could answer. "After everything?" His eyes looked brighter now. "After all these years?" Silence. "After every moment we've been through together?" JUNGKOOK simply stared at him. Jimin's voice trembled slightly. "You really believe that?" Nobody breathed. JUNGKOOK looked like someone had suddenly forgotten every answer he ever prepared. Because this was not how he expected the conversation to go. "Hi." He stopped. Jimin kept looking at him. "Answer me." JUNGKOOK swallowed hard. "Sometimes, yes." Silence. Jimin slowly looked down. He looked emotional again. Then he laughed softly, almost in disbelief. "Wow." Nobody spoke. Then Jimin looked up again. This time his eyes were red. "You've been carrying that fear for years." JUNGKOOK didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was already obvious. Jimin took a slow breath. Then another. Then he said something that made JUNGKOOK completely freeze. "Then maybe there's also something you never realized." Silence filled the room immediately. Jimmy slowly sat forward again. The audience became completely still. JUNGKOOK looked at him carefully. Jimin's expression had changed. There was something serious in his eyes now. Something almost fragile. He looked nervous. Then, after several long seconds, he quietly said, "I think." I was afraid of something too. And for the first time that night, it was JUNGKOOK who looked completely unprepared for what was coming next. Nobody moved, not even Jimmy Fallon. The audience looked from Jimin to JUNGKOOK and back again. Suddenly, The entire direction of the conversation had changed. A few seconds ago, JUNGKOOK had been the one revealing years of hidden feelings and fears. But now JIMIN was looking at him with an expression nobody expected. He looked nervous, almost vulnerable. JUNGKOOK blinked several times. "You were afraid too?" he asked quietly. JIMIN didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands. Then he took a slow breath. "I didn't know it until tonight." Silence. JUNGKOOK kept staring at him. Jimmy slowly leaned forward again. "Okay, I definitely wasn't expecting this." Nobody laughed. JIMIN slowly looked up. His eyes were still slightly red. "I think." He stopped and swallowed hard. "I think I was afraid you'd leave first." Complete silence. The words hit the room like lightning. JUNGKOOK's eyes widened. Jimmy's mouth slowly opened again. Even the audience reacted with soft gasps. JIMIN himself looked surprised by his own words, as if he had only just discovered the truth while saying it aloud. JUNGKOOK stared at him without blinking. "Me?" he whispered. JIMIN nodded once. "Yes." Nobody moved. JUNGKOOK looked completely stunned. "Why?" The question came out almost immediately. He sounded confused. Genuinely confused. JIMIN laughed softly. It was another emotional laugh. "See? That's exactly why I never realized it." He looked at JUNGKOOK carefully. "Because you always looked like you'd never leave." Silence. "You were always there." Another silence. "Every important moment." Silence again. "Every difficult time." His voice softened. "Every time I needed someone." JUNGKOOK remained completely still. JIMIN looked away for a second before continuing. "I guess I got used to it." Nobody in the room made a sound. JIMIN looked back at him. "I got used to you being beside me." The atmosphere became even heavier. JUNGKOOK's eyes slowly changed. There was something emotional in them now, something fragile. JIMIN kept talking, almost like he couldn't stop anymore. "So, I never thought about losing my place in your life." Silence. "Because I never imagined there could be a life where you weren't part of mine." Complete silence. Jimmy looked completely speechless. Backstage, the other BTS members looked just as shocked. Taeyoung slowly blinked. "Did he just?" Jin nodded slowly. "Yeah." J-Hope looked at the monitor without moving. Suga sighed quietly. RM remained completely silent. His eyes never left the screen. On stage, JUNGKOOK looked like someone had forgotten how to breathe. He couldn't take his eyes off Jimin. "You." His voice almost disappeared. "You thought that?" Jimin looked embarrassed suddenly. He looked away again. Apparently. A few people in the audience smiled softly through their emotions. Jimin rubbed the back of his neck. "I really didn't know until now." He looked at JUNGKOOK again. "I never thought about it carefully." Silence. "But hearing you talk tonight." He stopped. Then he smiled sadly. "I think I realized something." JUNGKOOK stared at him. "What?" Jimin looked directly into his eyes. "I've also been taking you for granted." Nobody moved. JUNGKOOK immediately shook his head. "No." Jimin blinked. "No?" JUNGKOOK looked almost alarmed now. "Don't say that." Jimin frowned. "But it's true." "No, it isn't." JUNGKOOK, "No." His answer came so quickly that it surprised everyone. Silence followed. JUNGKOOK's breathing was uneven now. He looked emotional too. "You never took me for granted." Jimin looked confused. "Then what did I do?" JUNGKOOK stared at him for several long seconds. Then he quietly answered, "You trusted me." Silence. Jimin didn't move. JUNGKOOK's eyes looked brighter now. "You trusted that I'd be there." Nobody breathed. And I was. Silence again. "Because I wanted to be." Jimin simply looked at him. Something inside his chest tightened again. JUNGKOOK continued softly, "I liked being someone you could depend on." Another silence. "I liked being someone important to you." Jimin looked like he couldn't process anything anymore. Jimmy looked emotional all over again. "I seriously need a minute," he admitted quietly. A few people laughed through their emotions. But then, everyone became silent again, because Jimin suddenly looked at JUNGKOOK differently. Really looked at him. The person sitting beside him. The person who remembered things he said years ago. The person who worried about him being lonely. The person who made plans because he couldn't imagine a future where Jimin wasn't there. And now, the same person was saying he liked being needed by him. Jimin's eyes slowly widened, because another realization suddenly appeared in his mind. Something he had never questioned before. Something that now seemed impossible to ignore. He looked at JUNGKOOK and quietly asked, "Since when?" JUNGKOOK blinked. "What?" Jimin swallowed hard. "Since when have I been this important to you?" The entire studio went completely silent, and for the first time that night, JUNGKOOK looked like he didn't know whether he should answer. The studio became so quiet that even the smallest sound seemed loud. "Since when have I been this important to you?" The question remained hanging in the air. JUNGKOOK simply stared at Jimin. He looked completely unprepared. Jimin kept looking at him, waiting. Jimmy Fallon slowly sat back in his chair. Even he seemed afraid to interrupt now. Nobody in the audience moved. Backstage, the other members were equally silent. Tae-young looked at the monitor with wide eyes. Jin slowly exhaled. Suga crossed his arms even tighter. J-Hope looked nervous. RM lowered his eyes for a moment, and then looked back at the screen. On stage, JUNGKOOK finally swallowed hard. "I don't know," he said softly. Jimin frowned. "You don't know?" JUNGKOOK slowly shook his head. "No. Silence. I can't remember exactly when." Another silence. "It just happened." Jimin blinked. JUNGKOOK looked down briefly before continuing. Little by little, nobody spoke. "One day I realized I was always looking for you first." Silence. "Then I realized I remembered everything you told me." Another silence. "Then I realized your bad days affected my mood too." The audience remained completely still. JUNGKOOK looked back at him. And then, he stopped. Jimin waited. "Then I realized I was thinking about your future almost as much as my own." Complete silence. Jimin simply stared at him, because every sentence somehow sounded heavier than the one before. Jimmy slowly covered his mouth again. He looked emotional and fascinated at the same time. Jimin lowered his eyes for a second. His heart was beating so hard that it almost hurt. He didn't know why, or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. He stopped. Then he laughed softly. "That's a lot." JUNGKOOK looked almost embarrassed now. "I know." Some people in the audience laughed quietly. The tension eased for only a few seconds. Then Jimin looked at him again. "And you carried all of that alone?" JUNGKOOK nodded once. Silence. "For years?" Another nod. Jimin stared at him. "How?" The question made JUNGKOOK blink. "What do you mean?" Jimin looked genuinely confused. "How did you do that?" His voice softened. "How did you keep all of this inside?" JUNGKOOK thought about it. Then he smiled faintly. "I guess I got used to it." Jimin's expression immediately changed. He didn't like that answer. "Not at all." "You got used to being lonely?" he asked quietly. JUNGKOOK looked surprised. "I wasn't lonely all the time, but sometimes you were." Silence. JUNGKOOK didn't answer. Jimin looked away again. He suddenly hated the thought of it. He hated imagining JUNGKOOK sitting alone somewhere, carrying worries and fears that nobody knew about. He hated imagining him smiling and saying he was fine when he wasn't. "Why does that bother me so much?" he whispered to himself. But unfortunately, his microphone caught it. The audience heard it. Jimmy heard it. JUNGKOOK heard it. Silence immediately filled the room again. Jimin slowly froze. He hadn't meant to say that out loud. Jimmy's eyes widened. He looked from one person to the other. Nobody spoke. Then JUNGKOOK quietly asked, "What?" Jimin looked mortified. "Nothing." "No." JUNGKOOK looked at him carefully now. "You said something." Jimin looked away. "Forget it." JUNGKOOK didn't move. "Why does what bother you?" The audience leaned forward again. Jimmy looked like he was witnessing another major turning point. Jimin looked trapped, completely trapped, because he didn't know the answer himself. Why did it bother him? Why did the idea of JUNGKOOK being lonely make his chest feel tight? Why did he suddenly feel guilty? Why did he suddenly feel sad? He slowly looked back at JUNGKOOK. Their eyes met, and for several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Jimin quietly admitted something. "Because I don't like imagining you going through difficult things by yourself." Silence. Jungkook stared at him. Jimin continued softly. I don't like thinking that you needed someone and didn't have anyone to talk to. Another silence. I don't like thinking that you were carrying something heavy and I didn't notice. Nobody moved. Jungkook simply looked at him. His expression had completely changed. He looked emotional now too. Jimin's voice became even softer. I don't like it. Silence. Absolute silence. Then Jungkook slowly asked, why? Jimin froze. He wasn't expecting the question. Why? He repeated. Jungkook nodded. His eyes never left him. Why don't you like it? The studio became so quiet that it almost felt unreal. Jimin looked directly into Jungkook's eyes. Then suddenly, he didn't know the answer anymore. Or maybe he knew it. Maybe that was exactly why he couldn't speak. Because for the first time that night, he was beginning to realize that maybe he had been carrying something too. Something so familiar that he never questioned it. Something that had quietly become part of his life over the years. And now, under these lights, with everyone watching, it was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Then Jimmy Fallon carefully asked the question that made both of them freeze. Can I ask something? Neither of them looked at him. Jimmy swallowed nervously. Then he said softly, do you two think you've been more important to each other than either of you realized? And suddenly, neither Jimin nor Jungkook knew how to answer. Nobody answered Jimmy's question. The silence itself became the answer. Jimin and Jungkook were still looking at each other, both seemingly unable to look away. Do you two think you've been more important to each other than either of you realized? The sentence remained in the air. Jimmy slowly looked between them. Okay, he said softly. I think I accidentally asked something dangerous. A few people in the audience laughed nervously, but even that laughter quickly disappeared, because neither Jimin nor Jungkook reacted. They simply kept staring at each other. Jimin's breathing was uneven. Jungkook's expression looked just as unsettled. Then Jimin finally lowered his eyes. He looked overwhelmed again. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Jungkook blinked. He looked at Jimin carefully, almost as if hearing those words hurt him somehow. You don't know? He asked softly. Jimin looked back at him. I've never thought about it before. Silence. Not like this. Another silence followed. Jungkook looked down at his hands. Then he nodded once. Me neither. Jimmy looked genuinely surprised. Really? Jungkook looked toward him. No. He looked back at Jimin again. I just thought some things were normal. Jimin frowned slightly. Like what? Jungkook answered immediately. Looking for you first. Silence. Wanting to tell you things first. Silence again. Worrying about whether you ate. Another silence. Noticing when you're sad even when you're smiling. Nobody moved. Jungkook's voice became softer. I thought those things were just normal. Jimin's eyes slowly widened, because every single thing Jungkook mentioned sounded familiar. Very familiar. Because he did those things too. Suddenly, memories started appearing one after another. Looking for Jungkook in airports. Saving food because Jungkook hadn't eaten yet. Feeling relieved when Jungkook looked happy. Becoming worried whenever Jungkook looked tired. Calling his name without even realizing it. Jimin suddenly looked away. His chest tightened again. Jimmy noticed immediately. Jimin? He looked back at him. Yeah? Jimmy looked curious. You okay? Jimin laughed softly. I don't think so. The audience laughed gently with him, but everyone could see that he wasn't joking. He really didn't know if he was okay anymore, because tonight felt like somebody had taken his entire understanding of his relationship with Jungkook and turned it upside down. Then Jungkook quietly asked, What are you thinking? Jimin looked at him. There was concern in Jungkook's eyes again. Always concern. Always attention. He suddenly remembered something from years ago. They had been at an award show. He had smiled all night. Nobody noticed he wasn't feeling well. Nobody except Jungkook. One look had been enough. Jungkook had immediately walked over and quietly asked if he was okay. Another memory appeared. Jimin getting injured during practice. Jungkook staying beside him longer than everyone else? Another memory. Jimin feeling anxious before an important performance. Jungkook sitting with him in silence because he knew words weren't necessary. Suddenly, another realization hit him. These moments had happened so many times that he stopped seeing them as special. They had simply become part of his life. JUNGKOOK had become part of his life, so naturally that he never questioned it. JIMIN slowly looked up again. Maybe? He stopped. JUNGKOOK waited. Maybe Jimmy's question isn't completely wrong. Complete silence. JUNGKOOK blinked. Jimmy's eyes widened. The audience immediately became still again. What do you mean? JUNGKOOK asked softly. JIMIN looked nervous now. Very nervous. He looked down and then back at JUNGKOOK. Maybe. He took a deep breath. Maybe we've both gotten so used to each other that we stopped noticing certain things. Nobody moved. JUNGKOOK kept looking at him. JIMIN continued quietly. Maybe we stopped realizing how much space we take up in each other's lives? Silence. The words seemed to affect JUNGKOOK immediately. He looked at JIMIN differently now, almost carefully. JIMIN's voice became softer. Because, honestly, he laughed nervously. I can't imagine certain things either. JUNGKOOK frowned slightly. What things? JIMIN swallowed hard. Then he looked directly into his eyes. I can't imagine you suddenly disappearing from my life. Silence. Nobody breathed. Jimmy looked completely stunned again. The audience remained perfectly still. JUNGKOOK looked frozen. JIMIN continued quietly. I can't imagine not hearing from you. Another silence. I can't imagine important moments happening and you not being there. His voice almost trembled, and apparently, he laughed softly again because he sounded surprised by himself. Apparently, I don't like the thought of you being lonely either. Nobody moved. JUNGKOOK looked like he had forgotten where he was. JIMIN slowly shook his head. I really didn't know any of this until tonight. Silence. Then JUNGKOOK asked the question almost in a whisper. Then, what does it mean? Complete silence. JIMIN froze. Jimmy froze. Even the audience looked like they had stopped breathing. Because that was the question, wasn't it? After everything they had revealed tonight, after years of fears and worries and unspoken feelings, what did all of this actually mean? JIMIN looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK looked back at him. Seconds passed. Then suddenly, from backstage, a familiar voice spoke through an earpiece connected to the production team. A staff member looked shocked and hurried toward Jimmy. Jimmy listened for 2 seconds. Then his eyes widened dramatically. He slowly looked at JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. He blinked several times. Guys. They both turned toward him. Jimmy looked completely stunned. I was just informed that the other BTS members are asking if they can come on stage right now. And for the first time in several minutes, both JIMIN and JUNGKOOK looked genuinely startled.
For several seconds, neither JIMIN nor JUNGKOOK said anything. They simply stared at Jimmy. The other members wanted to come on stage. Right now, Jimmy looked equally surprised. I don't know what's happening tonight, he admitted, but apparently your members have opinions. That made a few people in the audience laugh nervously. JIMIN finally blinked. They want to come out, Jimmy nodded. That's what I was told. JUNGKOOK looked completely caught off guard. Backstage, the 5 members were already standing near the entrance. RM looked serious. Jin looked worried. J-Hope looked nervous. Taehyung looked curious. Suga looked calm, but even he seemed concerned. A producer quietly asked them again if they were sure. RM nodded immediately. Yes. A few seconds later, Jimmy looked toward the camera and laughed softly. Okay, this is officially not the show I planned tonight. The audience laughed. Then the stage entrance opened. The entire studio erupted into cheers as RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, and Taehyung walked onto the stage. But unlike their usual appearances, none of them were smiling brightly. They looked serious. They walked toward the couch and stopped in front of JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. The atmosphere immediately became heavy again. Taehyung looked from one to the other. Wow, he blinked. The tension here is crazy. A few people laughed softly. Jin sighed deeply. I knew this would happen one day. The audience immediately reacted. Jimmy looked interested again. Wait, what does that mean? Jin suddenly looked like he had accidentally said too much. He looked at RM. RM rubbed his forehead. Suga quietly sat down. We're already here, might as well be honest. Jimin looked completely confused again. Honest about what? Nobody answered immediately. RM finally sat beside Jimmy and looked directly at JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. Can I ask something first? Jimin nodded slowly. RM looked at JUNGKOOK. Did you really tell him everything? Jungkook hesitated. Then he quietly said, almost. RM slowly closed his eyes. Jin immediately looked at him. You knew. RM opened his eyes again. I suspected. Jimin looked back and forth between them. Can someone please explain what's happening? Jimmy nodded quickly. I agree. I also need answers. Taehyung suddenly looked at Jungkook. You really told him about being afraid of losing your place in his life. Jungkook looked embarrassed and nodded once. Taehyung looked genuinely shocked. Wow, he sat down immediately. You actually said it. Jimin frowned. You all knew, nobody answered. Then J-Hope slowly raised his hand. Not everything. Jin nodded. Definitely not everything. Suga looked at Jimin. But we noticed things. Silence. Jimin looked confused. What things? Nobody spoke for several seconds, then RM sighed. The way you two are with each other. Silence. Jimin blinked. What about it? RM looked almost surprised by the question. Then he looked at everyone else. Jin looked at the ceiling. Taehyung suddenly looked very interested in the floor. J-Hope laughed nervously. Even Suga looked away. Jimmy looked fascinated. Okay, now I'm very curious. RM looked back at Jimin. You really don't know. Jimin looked even more confused. Know what? Silence again. Then RM said something that made the entire studio become completely still. There are times when you two act like the rest of the world disappears. Nobody moved. Jimin blinked. Jungkook looked frozen. RM continued calmly. We've seen it for years. Jin slowly nodded. Many years. J-Hope laughed softly. Actually, all the time. Taehyung nodded too. A lot. Jimin looked completely lost. I don't understand. Suga finally looked at him. That's because you're inside it. Silence. Jimmy's eyes widened again. He looked like he had discovered another chapter of the story. Suga continued. People outside notice things that people inside don't. Nobody moved. Jimin slowly looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked equally stunned now. RM looked at both of them. Sometimes we'd be talking and suddenly the two of you would start having your own conversation. Jin nodded. And completely forget everyone else existed. The audience laughed softly. J-Hope smiled. Or you'd somehow find each other in every room. Taehyung pointed at them. Every room. The audience laughed again. Then Taehyung became serious. Actually, it's true. Silence returned. Jimin looked increasingly overwhelmed. Jungkook looked just as unsettled. Then Jin softly said something that made both of them freeze again. Honestly, I think all of us realized years ago that you two are more important to each other than you realize yourselves. Complete silence filled the studio. Nobody moved. Jimin looked at Jin, then at Jungkook, then back at Jin again. Jungkook looked completely speechless. Jimmy slowly covered his mouth, because suddenly, this wasn't only one person's perspective anymore. It wasn't only Jungkook's fears. It wasn't only Jimin's realizations. Now there were 5 more people saying they had been seeing something for years, something that neither Jimin nor Jungkook had ever fully noticed, and judging by the serious expressions on all their faces, they weren't joking at all. Nobody on the stage moved. The audience was completely silent again. Jimin looked from one member to another as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. More important to each other than you realize yourselves. The sentence stayed inside his head. He slowly looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked equally shocked. Fallon blinked several times. Wait, he said carefully. You're all saying you've noticed this for years. RM nodded once. Yes. Jimmy looked at Jin. Years. Jin nodded too. Definitely years. Jimmy looked at Taehyung. Years. Taehyung laughed softly. A very long time. The audience reacted again. Jimmy looked completely fascinated now. Okay, this is unbelievable. He turned toward Jimin and Jungkook. Did you seriously have no idea? Jimin looked overwhelmed. He stopped, then he looked at Jungkook. Did you? Jungkook slowly shook his head. No, silence. Suga sighed quietly. See. The audience laughed softly. Suga continued. This is exactly why we're here. Jimin looked confused again. What do you mean? Suga crossed his arms. Because both of you miss obvious things. The audience laughed again. Even Jimmy smiled. Jimin looked almost offended. I don't miss obvious things. All 5 members immediately looked at him, then they looked at Jungkook, then back at Jimin. Nobody said a word. The audience burst into laughter. Even Jimin looked embarrassed. Taehyung laughed the hardest. You really do. Jimin looked at him. I don't. You do. I don't. Taehyung pointed at Jungkook. This entire interview happened because both of you missed obvious things. The audience laughed again. Jimin suddenly became quiet because, unfortunately, Taehyung had a point. RM looked at Jungkook. Can I ask something? Jungkook nodded slowly. RM's expression became serious again. When did you start worrying about losing your place in Jimin's life? Silence filled the stage immediately. JUNGKOOK looked down, he thought about it. Then he looked up again. I don't know exactly. RM nodded slowly, but it wasn't recent. No, silence, not recent. RM looked at him carefully. Years, JUNGKOOK nodded once, another silence followed. RM sighed quietly, then he looked at JIMIN. And when was the last time you imagined your future without JUNGKOOK in it? The question immediately changed everything again. JIMIN blinked. What? RM repeated calmly. When was the last time you imagined your future without him in it? Complete silence. JIMIN looked confused. He opened his mouth to answer, then suddenly, he stopped. He looked down, his expression slowly changed. Jimmy noticed immediately. Oh, nobody moved. JIMIN kept staring at the floor. He was thinking, really thinking. Then another realization slowly appeared on his face. Jin looked at him carefully. See, he said softly. JIMIN looked up again. He looked completely caught off guard by his own thoughts. He stopped. Then he laughed softly. It was another nervous laugh. I don't know. The audience reacted immediately. RM nodded slowly. Exactly. Silence. JIMIN looked at him. RM continued. Because somewhere along the way, he looked at both of them now, you both became part of each other's future automatically. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. JIMIN looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK looked back at him. RM's voice softened. You stopped imagining one without the other. Silence. Absolute silence. The words hit both of them at the same time. Because suddenly, it made sense. Every future plan, every conversation about tomorrow, every joke about getting older. Somehow they had always included each other naturally. Neither of them had questioned it. Neither of them had noticed it. Until now. JUNGKOOK looked stunned. JIMIN looked equally shocked. Jimmy slowly covered his face. This is insane. The audience laughed softly again. Jimmy looked at RM. Did you really know all of this? RM smiled faintly. Not everything. He looked at JIMIN and JUNGKOOK, but enough. Then Jin suddenly spoke. Actually, everyone looked at him. He looked slightly nervous. There's something else. The atmosphere immediately changed again. Taehyung looked at him. Hayoung. Jin ignored him. He looked directly at Jimin. Do you remember your birthday 2 years ago? Jimin blinked. What? Jin nodded. Your birthday. Jimin looked confused. Yes. Jin looked at JUNGKOOK, then back at Jimin. You canceled dinner with us because JUNGKOOK wasn't feeling well. Complete silence. Jimin froze. The audience looked confused. Jimmy looked interested again. Jin continued calmly. We told you we'd celebrate another day. Silence. But you said no. Jimin looked increasingly confused. I remember. Jin nodded. Do you remember what you said next? Silence. Jimin frowned. He tried to remember, but nothing came immediately. Then Suga quietly spoke for the first time in several minutes. You said birthdays happen every year. Complete silence. Jimin looked at him. Suga's expression remained calm. Then he finished the sentence. But there is only one JUNGKOOK. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Jimin's eyes slowly widened because suddenly he remembered saying it. And beside him, JUNGKOOK looked completely frozen because apparently he had never forgotten it. The studio went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. But there is only one JUNGKOOK. The words echoed through the room. Jimin stared at Suga, then slowly he looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK looked like someone had suddenly forgotten where he was. His eyes never left Jimin's face. Fallon blinked several times. Wait, he said softly. You actually said that? Jimin looked stunned. He slowly nodded. I think I did, Jin sighed. You definitely did. Taehyung laughed softly in disbelief. I remember because everyone became quiet after that. The audience remained completely still. Jimin looked down. The memory was becoming clearer now. It had been his birthday. Everyone wanted to celebrate, but JUNGKOOK had looked exhausted and sick. He remembered worrying. He remembered not wanting to leave him alone. And yes, he remembered saying those words. At that time, they felt completely natural. He never thought about them again, until now. Jimmy looked at him carefully. Why did you say it? Jimin looked up. He stopped. Then he looked at JUNGKOOK because he wasn't feeling well. Jimmy blinked. And Jimin looked confused by the question. And I didn't want him alone. Silence. Jimmy looked at him. On your birthday. Jimin looked even more confused. Yes. A few people in the audience laughed softly. Jimmy slowly turned toward the other members. Okay, I think I'm starting to understand why all of you came on stage. Jin laughed quietly. Exactly. RM looked at Jimin. The thing is, he stopped. You don't realize how naturally you prioritize each other. Silence. Jimin looked at him. RM continued calmly. You don't think about it. Silence. You just do it. Another silence followed. Jimin didn't know how to answer, because suddenly he remembered other moments. Canceling plans because JUNGKOOK looked tired. Staying awake because JUNGKOOK was still practicing. Worrying whenever JUNGKOOK seemed different. Looking for him without realizing it. He slowly looked toward JUNGKOOK again. JUNGKOOK was still staring at him. Then JUNGKOOK quietly asked, "You remember saying it now?" Jimin nodded slowly. "Yeah." Silence. JUNGKOOK's expression changed. He suddenly looked emotional again. "I thought you forgot." Jimin blinked. "You remembered." A soft laugh escaped JUNGKOOK. He almost looked offended by the question. "Of course I remembered." The audience reacted immediately. Jimin simply stared at him. JUNGKOOK smiled faintly. "You remember things that matter." Silence. Jimin's eyes softened slightly. Then he looked away because suddenly his chest felt tight again. Why was everything tonight making him emotional? Why did every memory suddenly feel different? Why did every little moment seem more important than before? Jimmy looked at JUNGKOOK. "Can I ask something?" JUNGKOOK nodded. Jimmy pointed toward Jimin. "How did you feel when he said there is only one JUNGKOOK?" The audience became completely silent again. JUNGKOOK froze. Apparently he wasn't expecting that question. He looked at Jimmy, then at Jimin, then down at his hands. Nobody moved. Several long seconds passed. Finally, JUNGKOOK quietly answered. "Happy." Silence. "Really happy." Another silence. "And..." He stopped. Jimin looked at him carefully. JUNGKOOK's voice became softer. "Safe." Complete silence. Jimin blinked. "Safe." JUNGKOOK nodded slowly. "Yeah." He looked at Jimin again. "Because for some reason," he laughed softly, "I felt like I mattered to you." Nobody moved. The room suddenly became emotional again. Jimin looked completely still because he never knew that. He never knew one sentence had stayed with JUNGKOOK for 2 years. He never knew it made him happy. He never knew it made him feel safe. Then Jin suddenly spoke again. "Actually." Everyone looked at him immediately. Taehyung sighed. "Hyung, why do I feel like you're about to make things worse?" The audience laughed softly. Jin ignored him. He looked at JUNGKOOK. "Didn't you keep the birthday bracelet?" Complete silence. JUNGKOOK froze. Jimin looked confused. "Bracelet," Jin nodded. "The one you gave him." Jimin blinked several times. "That old bracelet." Nobody moved. JUNGKOOK slowly closed his eyes. Taehyung looked shocked. "You still have that?" Suga laughed softly for the first time all night. J-Hope covered his face. RM looked like he already knew the answer. JUNGKOOK looked defeated. He slowly opened his eyes again. Jimmy looked fascinated. Wait, you still have a bracelet from 2 years ago." Silence. JUNGKOOK didn't answer. Jimmy looked even more interested. "JUNGKOOK." Finally, JUNGKOOK sighed quietly. "Yes." The audience immediately reacted. Jimin looked completely shocked. "You still have it?" JUNGKOOK nodded once. Jimin stared at him. "Why?" Another silence appeared. JUNGKOOK looked almost embarrassed now. Then he quietly answered, "Because you gave it to me." Complete silence. Nobody moved. Jimin looked like he had forgotten how to blink. Taehyung suddenly laughed again. "See, this is exactly what we're talking about." The audience laughed softly, but Jimin couldn't laugh. He was still staring at JUNGKOOK because he honestly didn't even remember giving him that bracelet. Yet somehow, JUNGKOOK still had it. After 2 years. Then JUNGKOOK looked directly into his eyes and said something that made the entire studio go silent once more. "I think I've kept almost everything you've ever given me." And this time, even Jimin didn't know what to do with his own heartbeat anymore. The entire studio exploded with reactions. Some people gasped, some laughed in disbelief. Jimmy Fallon slowly put both hands on his head. "No way." He looked at JUNGKOOK. "Absolutely no way." JUNGKOOK looked like he wanted to disappear. He suddenly became very interested in staring at the floor, but unfortunately everyone was staring at him now. Jimin looked completely frozen. "Almost everything," he repeated softly. JUNGKOOK didn't answer. "JUNGKOOK." The younger man slowly closed his eyes again. The audience laughed softly. Jimin blinked several times. "You mean?" He stopped because he couldn't even believe the question he was about to ask. "You mean you still have things I gave you years ago?" Silence. JUNGKOOK sighed quietly. Then he nodded once. The audience reacted again. Jimmy pointed at him. "This is unbelievable." Taehyung suddenly laughed so hard that he leaned back on the couch. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore." Jin laughed too. Even Suga looked amused now. J-Hope covered his mouth because he was trying not to laugh. RM simply looked at JUNGKOOK with an expression that said he had expected this answer. Jimin looked back and forth between everyone. "You all knew." Jin immediately nodded. "Some of it." Taehyung laughed again. "Actually, more than some of it." JUNGKOOK looked horrified. "Hyung." Nobody listened to him. Jimmy looked delighted now. Okay, I need details. The audience laughed and clapped. JUNGKOOK looked even more uncomfortable. Jin smiled. He keeps little things. Silence. Cards. Another silence. Small gifts. Silence again. Random things that probably don't mean anything to anyone else. JIMIN slowly turned toward JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK still wasn't looking at him. Taehyung pointed at him. There was even a snack wrapper once. The entire studio burst into laughter. JUNGKOOK immediately looked up. That happened one time. Taehyung laughed even harder. You admitted it. More laughter filled the room. Even Jimmy had tears in his eyes from laughing. JIMIN looked absolutely stunned. A snack wrapper? JUNGKOOK looked like he regretted every decision he had made tonight. Forget I said anything. Nobody forgot. The audience laughed again. Then Suga quietly spoke. The point isn't the wrapper. Everyone looked at him. Suga looked at JIMIN. The point is that he keeps things that remind him of people he cares about. Silence. The laughter slowly disappeared. The room became emotional again. JIMIN looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK looked away. Suddenly the idea didn't seem funny anymore because now he understood something. JUNGKOOK remembered things, he held onto things. Little moments, little words, little memories. Things that most people forgot, things JIMIN himself forgot. But JUNGKOOK didn't. JIMIN slowly asked, why? JUNGKOOK looked back at him. What? JIMIN's voice became softer. Why keep them? Silence. JUNGKOOK looked at him for several seconds, then he answered so quietly that the entire room listened carefully. Because memories disappear. Nobody moved. People get busy. Silence. Years pass. Another silence. Then he looked directly into JIMIN's eyes. I didn't want to forget the things that made me happy. Complete silence. Nobody breathed loudly. JIMIN simply stared at him. Because suddenly that answer felt incredibly sad, incredibly warm, and somehow incredibly lonely. Jimmy slowly lowered his hands, even he looked emotional again. You really remember everything, don't you? He asked softly. JUNGKOOK thought about it, then he smiled faintly. Not everything. He looked at JIMIN. Just the important things. Silence. JIMIN's eyes slowly became brighter again, because once more he realized something he never knew. To JUNGKOOK, all those little moments mattered. Things JIMIN never thought twice about had become precious memories to someone else. Then RM suddenly spoke. Can I say something? Everyone looked at him. RM looked at JIMIN carefully. I think tonight you're learning something we've all known for a long time. Silence. JIMIN looked at him. RM's expression softened. You matter a lot to him. Nobody moved. The words were simple, but hearing someone else say them made the atmosphere feel different. He matters a lot to him. JIMIN looked toward JUNGKOOK again. JUNGKOOK looked almost nervous now, as if he didn't know what to do with all these truths being spoken aloud. Then RM looked at JUNGKOOK too. And I think you're learning something tonight as well. Silence. JUNGKOOK blinked. RM smiled softly. You matter a lot to him too. Complete silence. Nobody moved. JIMIN and JUNGKOOK looked at each other again. This time neither of them looked away. Something had changed. Something important. The fears suddenly seemed smaller. The misunderstandings suddenly seemed clearer. Because after everything that had been said tonight, one thing had become impossible to deny. They had both been carrying the same assumption for years. The assumption that maybe they cared more than the other person realized. But apparently, both of them had been wrong, because somehow, without noticing, they had become deeply woven into each other's lives. Then Jimmy quietly cleared his throat. Everyone looked at him. He looked unusually serious now. Can I ask one last question? Nobody answered, but nobody stopped him either. Jimmy looked directly at JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. Then he softly asked, after everything you've learned tonight, when this show ends and all the cameras turn off, what happens between the two of you next? And suddenly, for the second time that night, neither JIMIN nor JUNGKOOK knew the answer. Nobody answered Jimmy's question. The entire stage became quiet again. What happens between the two of you next? JIMIN looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK looked back at him. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then suddenly, JIMIN laughed softly. It wasn't because something was funny. It was because he genuinely didn't know what else to do. Tonight had changed too much. Too many things had been said. Too many things had been discovered. JUNGKOOK smiled a little too. He looked overwhelmed. Jimmy looked at both of them and shook his head. I've hosted this show for years, he said softly. I've never seen anything like this. The audience applauded, not loudly, just softly, almost warmly. The members smiled as well. The atmosphere had changed again. The tension was still there, but now there was something else too, relief, honesty, understanding. JIMIN looked down at his hands for a second, then he slowly looked back at JUNGKOOK. Can I ask something? JUNGKOOK nodded immediately. Anything. The answer came so quickly that the audience smiled. Jimin noticed too. He laughed softly again. See, Jungkook blinked. What? Jimin looked at him. You always do that. Jungkook looked confused. Do what? Jimin smiled faintly. You always make it sound like I'd never bother you. Silence. Jungkook frowned slightly. Because you don't. Jimin looked at him. Then he laughed again, this time shaking his head. The audience laughed softly with him. You're unbelievable. Jungkook looked completely serious. I'm telling the truth. That made Jimin stop laughing because once again, Jungkook sounded sincere, completely sincere. Jimin stared at him for a few seconds, then he quietly asked, Have I really never been a burden to you? The room became silent again. Jungkook looked surprised by the question, then he looked almost sad. Why would you ask me that? Jimin shrugged slightly. I don't know, he smiled softly. Maybe because tonight I'm realizing I never asked. Nobody moved. Jungkook looked at him carefully, then he answered immediately. Never. Silence. Not once. Another silence. Not even a little. Jimin asked softly. Jungkook smiled this time. Not even a little. Nobody spoke. Jimin simply looked at him, then he slowly lowered his eyes because suddenly, he looked emotional again. Jimmy noticed immediately. Oh no, he said softly. We're all going to cry again. The audience laughed gently, but Jimin's eyes were already red. Jungkook noticed too. His expression immediately changed. Hey! Jimin looked up. Jungkook looked worried again. Why do you look like you're about to cry? The audience smiled softly. There it was again, immediate concern, immediate attention. Jimin stared at him for several seconds, then he quietly said, Because tonight feels strange. Jungkook blinked. Strange, Jimin nodded. Yeah, he smiled sadly. I feel like I just met a side of you I've never seen before. Silence. Jungkook didn't speak. Jimin looked at him carefully, and somehow, he stopped, then he laughed softly again. I feel like you've been carrying all of this in front of me for years and I just never noticed. Nobody moved. Jungkook's expression softened. Maybe I hid it too well. Jimin immediately shook his head. No, silence, I think. He looked down briefly. I think I was too comfortable. The audience became quiet again. Jimin looked back at him. I got used to having you around. Silence. I got used to you caring. Another silence. I got used to you being there every time I looked for you. His voice became softer. So I stopped wondering why. Nobody moved. Jungkook simply stared at him. Jimin smiled sadly. I think I just thought we'd always stay like this. Silence filled the room again. Then Jungkook quietly asked, and now? Jimin looked at him. Their eyes met. Now, he stopped. The question was difficult because honestly, he didn't know. Everything was different now. He knew things he had never known before. He understood things he had never understood before. And somehow all those years suddenly looked different. Then he slowly smiled. Now I think I need time. The audience laughed softly. Even Jungkook smiled. Jimmy laughed too. That's actually the healthiest answer anyone has given tonight. More laughter filled the studio. The tension eased again. Jimin looked at Jungkook and smiled a little more. I think my brain is still trying to catch up. Jungkook laughed quietly. Mine too. The audience laughed again. Then suddenly Taehyung looked at both of them and grinned. Can I say something? Everyone looked at him. He looked suspiciously happy now. I think this is great. Jin looked at him. Why? Taehyung smiled even wider. Because now both of you know. Silence. He pointed at Jimin. You know you matter to him. Then he pointed at Jungkook. And you know you matter to him. He smiled brightly. Everybody wins. The audience laughed and applauded. Even Suga smiled. J-Hope laughed loudly. RM shook his head with a smile. Jimin looked at Jungkook again. Jungkook looked back at him, then unexpectedly, they both started laughing. Not because something was funny, but because somehow, Taehyung wasn't wrong. After years of misunderstandings and silent worries, one thing had finally become clear. Neither of them had ever been alone in what they felt, and for the first time that night, the fear in Jungkook's eyes was gone, and the confusion in Jimin's eyes had slowly started becoming something else entirely, something warmer, something new, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them could feel it, and somehow, neither of them looked away. The audience slowly applauded again. The atmosphere no longer felt heavy in the same way it had at the beginning of the interview. The tension was still there, but now it was mixed with relief. Years of unspoken thoughts had finally been said out loud. Jimin looked at Jungkook and suddenly smiled again. This time it was softer, warmer. Jungkook noticed immediately and smiled back without even realizing it. Jimmy looked between them and laughed quietly. You know what's funny? Everyone looked at him. He pointed at the two of them. You both look much calmer than 30 minutes ago. The audience laughed softly. Jimin immediately nodded. That's true. Jungkook laughed quietly too. Jimmy looked amazed. How? Jimin thought about it, then he looked toward Jungkook again. I think, he stopped. I think because there are no secrets right now. Silence. Jungkook's expression changed slightly. Jimin continued softly. Tonight was shocking. Another silence. But at least now I know what was inside your head. Nobody moved. Jungkook looked at him carefully, then he nodded slowly. Yeah, silence, and honestly, Jimin smiled a little, I'm relieved. This time it was Jungkook's turn to look surprised. Relieved, Jimin nodded. Yes. Jungkook blinked several times. Why? Jimin laughed softly. Because for a moment, he looked embarrassed suddenly. I thought your secret wedding plan meant you were leaving. Complete silence. Jungkook froze, so did everyone else. Jimmy's eyes widened. The audience gasped softly. Jimin looked away immediately. I know it sounds ridiculous, but nobody looked like they thought it was ridiculous. Jungkook was staring at him as if he had just heard something impossible. You thought I was leaving? He asked quietly. Jimin looked back at him, then he laughed awkwardly. Well, yes, silence. You suddenly announced a wedding plan on live television. Another silence, and I didn't know anything about it. The audience laughed softly. Jimin smiled nervously. So yes. For a minute there, I thought I was about to lose my mind. More laughter spread through the studio, but Jungkook wasn't laughing, he was still staring at him. You thought I was leaving, he repeated softly. Jimin nodded once. Complete silence followed, then suddenly, Jungkook smiled, not a small smile, a real one, the kind that reached his eyes. Jimin blinked. Why are you smiling? Jungkook looked at him. I don't know, he laughed softly. He looked down briefly before looking back up. I didn't know you'd think that. Jimin looked confused. Why? Jungkook smiled again. Because I never planned to go anywhere. Silence. Jimin stared at him. Jungkook's expression softened. Not from you. Nobody moved. The audience became quiet again. Because somehow those three words sounded simple and important at the same time. Not from you. Jimin looked at him for several long seconds. Then he smiled too. A very small smile, but it was there. Taehyung immediately pointed at both of them. There. Everyone looked at him. He grinned. That's the look. Jimin blinked. What look? Taehyung looked completely serious. The one where everybody else disappears. The audience burst into laughter. Jimin immediately looked embarrassed. Jungkook laughed quietly. Jin covered his face because he was laughing too. Even RM was smiling now. J-Hope nearly fell off his chair laughing. Suga simply shook his head. Jimin looked at Taehyung. That doesn't happen. All 5 members immediately looked at him again. Then they all looked at Jungkook, then back at Jimin. Nobody said anything. The audience laughed even harder. Jimin laughed too this time because apparently he had already lost this argument. Then RM looked at him and smiled softly. You know, Jimin looked at him. RM's expression became gentle. I haven't seen you this relaxed all night. Jimin blinked. Really? RM nodded. Yeah, silence. Then he looked at Jungkook. And honestly, he smiled. Neither have I. Jungkook looked surprised. RM nodded again. You've both looked worried since the interview started. Silence. Now you don't. The room became quiet because it was true. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was still there, but the fear wasn't. Jimin slowly looked at Jungkook again, then he noticed something. Jungkook looked lighter, like someone had finally put down something heavy after carrying it for a long time. Jimin's expression softened immediately. You're really okay? He asked quietly. Jungkook looked at him. Then he smiled again. Yeah, silence. I think I am. Nobody moved. Jimin smiled too. Good. The answer came out softly, naturally, and somehow hearing that one simple word made Jungkook's smile become even bigger. Jimmy immediately pointed at him. There, he smiled again. The audience laughed and applauded. Jungkook looked embarrassed. Jimin laughed beside him. Then suddenly, Jimmy looked at them both and shook his head in amazement. You know what? Everyone looked at him. Jimmy smiled warmly. I think millions of people are watching 2 people realize how important they are to each other in real time. Complete silence. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Because maybe Jimmy wasn't wrong. Maybe tonight wasn't about a wedding plan at all. Maybe it wasn't about secrets either. Maybe tonight was simply the moment 2 people finally understood something that had been quietly true for a very long time. And as they looked at each other again, neither of them seemed in any hurry to look away. Applause slowly faded, but the atmosphere on the stage remained warm. Nobody seemed eager for the conversation to end. Even Jimmy looked like he wanted to keep listening. Jimin and Jungkook were still sitting beside each other, and for the first time that night, both of them looked calm. Not completely calm, but calmer. Then Jimmy suddenly smiled. "Can I ask one more thing?" The audience laughed. Jimin laughed too. "You said that 5 questions ago." More laughter filled the studio. Jimmy raised his hands. "No, I know, but this one is important." He looked at Jungkook. "You came here tonight planning to reveal your wedding plan." Jungkook nodded. Jimmy looked at him carefully. "After everything that happened tonight, would you still call it a wedding plan?" The room immediately became quiet again. Jungkook blinked. Apparently he wasn't expecting that question. He looked down for a second, then he looked at Jimin. Jimin looked curious too. Several long seconds passed. Finally, Jungkook smiled softly. "No." Silence. Jimmy smiled. "No." Jungkook slowly shook his head. "No." Another silence. "Then what was it?" Jimmy asked gently. Jungkook thought about it, then he laughed softly. "I think," he stopped. "I think it was never really about marriage." Nobody moved. Jungkook looked toward Jimin again. "I think it was my way of trying to protect something important." Silence. Jimin's expression softened immediately. Jungkook continued quietly. "I kept thinking about the future." Another silence. "I kept making plans." He smiled awkwardly. "A lot of plans." The audience laughed softly. Jungkook laughed too, and all those plans had one thing in common. Jimmy looked interested. "What?" Jungkook looked directly at Jimin. "He was always there." Complete silence. Nobody moved. Jimin simply stared at him, because once again the answer sounded simple and enormous at the same time. He was always there. Jungkook smiled softly. "Every version of my future somehow included him." Silence. "And I think that's why I panicked 3 days ago." Another silence. "Because when he said everyone eventually leaves." He stopped, then he laughed quietly. "I suddenly realized I didn't know how to imagine that." Nobody moved. Jimin's eyes slowly became brighter again. Jimmy looked emotional. The members looked emotional too. Then unexpectedly, Jimin spoke. "I don't know how to imagine it either." Silence. Every head turned toward him. Jimin looked slightly surprised that he had said it out loud. But then he looked at Jungkook and smiled softly. "Apparently." A few people laughed through their emotions. Jungkook simply stared at him. Then he smiled too. It was a small smile, but it looked different. It looked relieved. Then Jin suddenly sighed loudly. Everyone looked at him. He shook his head. "I feel like I watched 10 years of conversations happen in one night." The audience laughed and applauded. J-Hope laughed too. "Honestly, same." Taehyung nodded quickly. "I need to process this." More laughter filled the room. Even Suga was smiling again. RM looked at Jimin and Jungkook quietly. Then he said softly, "I think tonight was necessary." Silence returned. Jimin looked at him. RM smiled gently. "Some things should never stay hidden forever." Nobody moved. Jungkook looked thoughtful. Jimin slowly nodded, because he agreed. If tonight had never happened, he would still believe Jungkook's secret wedding plan had nothing to do with him. He would never know someone had spent years worrying about him. He would never know he mattered that much to someone sitting right beside him. And Jungkook would never know something either. He would never know that Jimin couldn't imagine him disappearing from his life. He would never know that his presence had become something natural and important. Suddenly, Jimin smiled again. Then he looked at Jungkook. "Can I tell you something?" Jungkook nodded immediately. "Anything." The audience laughed again. Jimin laughed too, then he looked at him carefully. "Thank you." Silence. Jungkook blinked. "For what?" Jimin's smile became softer. "For worrying about me." Complete silence. "You really didn't have to do that." Another silence. "But," he looked almost emotional again. "Thank you anyway." Nobody moved. Jungkook stared at him for several seconds. Then he smiled, a real smile. "You're welcome." Silence. Then he added quietly, "I'd probably do it again." The audience immediately reacted with laughter and applause. Jimin laughed too. He shook his head. "See, this is what I mean." Jungkook laughed quietly, but then something happened. The laughter faded and they looked at each other again. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Then Jimin smiled softly and shook his head one more time. "You're really something else." Jungkook smiled back. "So I've been told." The audience laughed again, but Jimmy didn't laugh. He simply looked at the two of them and smiled warmly. Because right there, under the bright studio lights, after an entire night of secrets, fears, and confessions, two people were looking at each other with a kind of understanding that hadn't existed a few hours earlier. And somehow, everyone in the room could feel it. Something had changed tonight, something important, something neither of them had words for yet, but it was there, quietly, clearly, right between them. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The studio felt strangely peaceful now. The tension that had filled the room at the beginning of the interview was gone. In its place was something quieter, something warmer. Jimmy Fallon slowly looked around the stage and smiled. I honestly don't know how we're supposed to end this. The audience laughed softly. JIMIN laughed too. Even JUNGKOOK smiled again. Then Jimmy looked directly at them. Actually, he paused. I think I do know how to end this. Everyone looked at him. Jimmy's expression became gentle. Tonight started because of one sentence. Silence. He looked at JUNGKOOK. You said you had a wedding plan. Then he looked at JIMIN. And for a few minutes, he laughed softly. I thought we were about to witness a disaster. The audience laughed loudly. JIMIN covered his face because he was laughing too. JUNGKOOK laughed beside him. Jimmy smiled. Then he became serious again. But instead, he looked at both of them. I think we watched two people realize they were never as alone as they thought. Silence filled the room. Nobody laughed this time because somehow it was true. JUNGKOOK looked at JIMIN. JIMIN looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. Jimmy smiled warmly. And honestly, he looked at the audience. I think that's beautiful. The audience immediately applauded. The members clapped too. Taehyung looked suspiciously emotional. Jin was smiling. J-Hope looked proud. Suga looked relaxed for the first time all night. RM simply watched the two of them quietly. Then he smiled too. Jimin slowly looked down. He suddenly felt overwhelmed again, but it was different from before. Earlier, he had been confused, shocked, afraid. Now, he simply felt grateful. Grateful that tonight happened. Grateful that JUNGKOOK had spoken honestly. Grateful that the secret wasn't really a goodbye. Then he looked toward JUNGKOOK again. JUNGKOOK looked at him almost at the exact same moment. They both laughed softly. The audience laughed with them. Jimmy immediately pointed at them. There it is again. More laughter spread through the studio. Jimin laughed harder this time. What? Jimmy looked amused. You both keep looking at each other at the same time. Taehyung immediately raised his hand. I would like to officially confirm this happens constantly. The audience laughed loudly. Jimin shook his head. No, it doesn't. Every member looked at him again. The audience laughed even harder. Jimin finally gave up and laughed too. Then unexpectedly, RM stood up. Everyone looked at him. He smiled softly and looked at Jimin and JUNGKOOK. I think we should go. Silence. Jimin blinked. Already? RM nodded. It's late. Then he smiled slightly. And I think there are some conversations that shouldn't happen in front of millions of people. The entire audience laughed and applauded. Even Jimmy looked amused. JUNGKOOK looked embarrassed immediately. Jimin laughed too. Then Taehyung suddenly stood up. I agree. He pointed at both of them dramatically. I have approximately 500 questions. More laughter filled the studio. Jin laughed, J-Hope laughed, even Suga smiled again. Then Jimmy stood up too. Okay, before all of you disappear backstage. Everyone looked at him. Jimmy smiled warmly. Can I ask one final question? Nobody objected. Jimmy looked at JUNGKOOK first. Do you still have a wedding plan? The audience laughed softly. JUNGKOOK thought about it. Then he smiled. No. Jimmy looked at him carefully. No. JUNGKOOK slowly shook his head. I think. He looked toward Jimin. I have something better. Silence. Jimin blinked. Jimmy looked curious. What? JUNGKOOK smiled softly. A conversation. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Then the audience slowly began applauding again. Jimin simply stared at him. A conversation. Somehow that answer felt perfect. No secret plans, no fears, no years of carrying everything alone, just a conversation. Then Jimmy looked at Jimin. And what about you? Jimin looked surprised. Me, Jimmy nodded. Yeah, silence. What are you taking away from tonight? The room became quiet one last time. Jimin looked down, then he looked at JUNGKOOK, then at the members, then at Jimmy. Finally, he smiled softly. I think. He stopped. I think I learned something important. Jimmy waited. Jimin's expression became gentle. Some people become so important to you. Silence. That you stop noticing how much they matter because having them beside you starts feeling natural. Nobody moved. Jimin looked directly at JUNGKOOK. Then he smiled again. Tonight reminded me not to forget that. Complete silence. Then suddenly the entire studio stood up and applauded. Jimmy clapped. The audience clapped. The members clapped. Even JUNGKOOK looked emotional again. Jimin looked embarrassed by the standing ovation and started laughing. JUNGKOOK laughed too. Then, without thinking, they looked at each other once more. And for the first time that night, there was no confusion in either of their eyes anymore. Just understanding. Just relief. Just the quiet realization that after years of standing beside each other, they had finally said things that should have been said a long time ago. Then the lights slowly dimmed, the applause continued, and Jimmy smiled at the two of them one last time. But as Jimin and JUNGKOOK stood up from the couch, neither of them noticed one small thing. RM was watching them very carefully, and the look on his face suggested he had just realized something that neither of them had discovered yet. The applause slowly faded as the cameras prepared to stop recording. Jimmy shook everyone's hands one by one. The members stood together near the center of the stage, smiling and talking quietly. Everything looked normal again, almost too normal. Then the red recording light finally turned off. The audience continued clapping as staff members moved around the studio. Some people began leaving their seats. Producers approached Jimmy. Cameras were lowered. And for the first time that night, there were no microphones between Jimin and JUNGKOOK. They looked at each other. Neither of them spoke. Then JUNGKOOK smiled. Jimin smiled back. It was quiet, comfortable, as if everything difficult had already been said. Then RM suddenly walked over. His expression was strange. Not worried. Not upset. Just thoughtful. He looked at Jimin. Then at JUNGKOOK. Then he quietly said, "I need to ask both of you something." Jimin blinked. "What?" RM looked at them carefully. When JUNGKOOK said he couldn't imagine his future without you. Silence. And when you said you couldn't imagine your life without him. Another silence. RM slowly folded his arms. Did either of you hear yourselves? The smiles on Jimin's and JUNGKOOK's faces slowly disappeared. Neither answered. RM looked almost amused now. No, seriously. He looked directly at them. Did you actually hear what you were saying tonight? Silence. Jimin suddenly looked confused. JUNGKOOK frowned. RM sighed softly. Then he smiled. A very small smile. I don't think tonight was the end of something. Silence. I think it was the beginning. Nobody moved. Taehyung suddenly looked between all three of them. Then his eyes widened. Oh. Jin looked at him. Taehyung looked at RM again. Oh. J-Hope blinked. Suga slowly looked up. And suddenly, all four of them were staring at Jimin and JUNGKOOK. Jimin looked even more confused. What? Nobody answered. JUNGKOOK looked around nervously. Why are you all looking at us? Silence. Then Jin laughed softly. One short laugh. As if he had just understood something. Jimin frowned. Hyung. Jin covered his mouth. No. Taehyung looked completely shocked. No way. J-Hope slowly smiled. Suga shook his head once. RM simply looked at both of them. Then he quietly said something that made the entire atmosphere change again. I don't think either of you realizes what tonight actually revealed. Complete silence. Jimin froze. JUNGKOOK froze. Neither of them spoke. RM looked at them one last time. Then he smiled. Let's go backstage. And as the members slowly walked away together, Jimin and JUNGKOOK remained standing under the dim studio lights for a few more seconds. Both of them had the exact same question. What did RM realize? Neither of them knew. But judging by the expressions on the other members' faces, whatever it was only the beginning.